Let's get that up. Okay, where is the... How do you share? How do you link? How do you walk around like your poop don't stink? Is that how you share? Okay, there we go. All right, so okay, what do we got? What do we got? What do we got? There we are. Okay. All right, so we're going to... What do we got? Go live. We'll allow it. All right. Waiting for it to spool up here. Okay, very good. We're live. Oh, excuse me. Sometimes I forget the camera's on, folks. Sorry about that. All right. All right, so that's the YouTube. There's the link for the handout. We're up to Revelation 14 and 15, so I think that's week 8 down at the bottom of that page. And I'm going to go ahead and post Gilmore's 4 rules as I do for reading Revelation. Now, as I said before, if you are watching live right now and the feed starts to get a little bit jumpy, if you go up to that YouTube link over in the comments, that is a second live stream. The internet here at the house is fast enough that I can maintain 2 live streams, although my kids won't be able to play their online games, but that's probably good for them. So if at any point the YouTube stream, no, strike that, reverse it. If the Facebook stream gets a little bit jumpy on you, try out that YouTube stream, see if it works any better. This is an experiment. There's no guarantee that it'll work any better. I see Miriam here is looking through the window behind me. Got about 3 minutes till official start time, so I see Pat and Junior are with us. That's good. Where are we now? There we go. I'm going to open that in another tab. Okay, good. Okay, checking over to the YouTube stream. It looks like it's going well. Like I said, that's mainly a backup thing. So if I don't get any views on that, my feelings will not be hurt. Good morning to Pat and Junior. Good morning to Tammy. Got about 2 minutes here till we get started. And like I said, we'll be in Revelation 14 starting out here. So get your Bibles open to there. And Obi's here. Good morning, Obi. Got about 2 minutes till we start up. You know, like I said, I'm just checking all of these lovely computer systems, see if I can give everyone the best chance possible of seeing and hearing what's going on this morning at Virtual Sunday School. We'll be in Revelation 14, and we'll be starting off with an opening prayer here in about a minute. So I'm going to give people a little bit more time to get online and join us. Okay. And Jennifer's here. Good morning, Jennifer. So, yeah, about a minute left. It sounds like my neighbor's firing up the truck, so you'll be able to hear both some birds and some combustion engines this morning while we do our thing. It is getting warm out here, which I suppose happens in late May in Georgia. All right, well, according to the clock on my computer, it does seem to be 10 o'clock. I'll just go ahead and remind you, if the Facebook video gets herky-jerky, there's a comment over in the margin for a YouTube live stream. Hopefully that'll give you, a little bit more reliable video if the YouTube servers aren't serving. If neither one of them works, then it is probably your home internet, because at that point we've got the processing power of two of the largest internet companies in the world trying to get this video to you. All right. Yes, indeed, Obi. Humid as well. It is 10 o'clock. Let's go ahead and have a prayer together, and then we'll launch into today's lesson. Pray with me. God, we thank you for chances that we get to study your scripture. We've kind of gotten accustomed now to studying it over digital cameras and computers and phones and digital devices. Help us, God, to appreciate this gift no matter what medium it takes. And God, as we study Revelation 14 and 15, these books that so often get interpreted as texts of terror designed to frighten the faithful into compliance, help us, God, to hear your promise for those first century believers, so that we in turn can draw from that the truth of your good news. And it's through Christ we pray these things. Amen. All right. So, Revelation 14 and 15, we're making our way through here. As we talked about last week, Revelation doesn't go in a straight line as far as its vision goes. But instead we get what I like to call two vision cycles. One of them starts roughly in Revelation 4, goes out roughly to Revelation 11. The other one starts in Revelation 12 and goes out to the end of the book. And here's what makes them tricky, is that they are not simply two stories that go start to finish, but they overlap with each other. Different characters appear in both of them. Different events happen in both of them. And what we've got here, again, is something that is a revelation, just like the name of the book, something that God has sent to us. And, I'll be sure to relay to Miriam the greetings. But its order, like I said, is not what we are accustomed to. Even a fairly experimental movie, we have the temptation to, try to piece together the timelines, turn it into a straightforward beginning to end story. I suppose the temptation is here as well, just as long as we realize that that's not the form that it's already in. All right. So I'm going to start reading, chapter 14 here. Remember, the beast has come out of the sea. It has marked people with the number of Nero Caesar, 660 and 6. Like I said, this is happening a good 50 years, probably, maybe 40 years after the death of Nero Caesar. So a couple different theories abide here. One of them is that, Revelation is a book that is participating in this conspiracy, if you will, in the first century, that Nero never actually died and that he is secretly ruling Rome, from beyond the dead. I don't know. As you can tell, I don't find that entirely convincing. What I see more of here in Revelation is an idea that really stems from the Old Testament and the Old Testament's identification of every Egyptian ruler simply as Pharaoh. We don't get Ramesses, we don't get Seti, we don't get Tutankhamun, we don't get different names for different pharaohs necessarily. They're all just Pharaoh. And here, instead of every Pharaoh being the same, every Nero is the same, whether we call him Domitian, whether we call him Marcus Aurelius, whatever we want to call him, right? So again, I think that is a biblical pattern. I think that's probably what's going on here. As I've said a number of times, don't take my reading as the ultimate and insurmountable, that's the word, reading, but rather take it as, one reading to bring to the text. If it makes more sense, use it. If there's another text, if there's another interpretation that makes more sense, use that. All right. So for real now, I'm going to read the first 5 verses of Revelation 14. I'm in the New Revised Standard Version. This is the version that is in the Pew Bibles there at Bogart Christian Church. But it derives from the King James Version like most English Bibles do, so you should be able to follow along pretty nicely. Revelation 14, verse 1. Then I looked, and there was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him were 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who have been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. These follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They have been redeemed from humankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found. They are blameless. And so here once again we get this vision of the 144,000. Now we get very specific with them. These are not, the sum total of those who are sealed, because we've already seen back in chapter 11 the countless multitudes from every tongue and tribe and nation. But these are specifically those who have not defiled themselves with women. You'll remember, or maybe if you don't remember, I'll tell you, this was a custom. We get it archaeologically from a lot of Mediterranean kingdoms and empires, but we also get it from Israel, which is one of those Mediterranean kingdoms, that when you are on the field, one of the things that a warrior is not to do is to have sex. You remember the story of Uriah the Hittite. David brings him home to cover up the fact that he has had an affair with his wife Bathsheba. And one of the obstacles that David faces, in addition to his own sins, is that Uriah, being a good warrior, knows that while the battle is still going on, he can't have sex, and so David can't cover up the pregnancy. And if you don't know that story, then 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12 will lay that out for you. It's really a fascinating story. One of those is kind of weird that it gets into the Bible, but there you have it. But these are specifically marked out as warriors. We get a lot of images from the prophets. Remember, one of the Gilmore's rules of reading Revelation is to hear this as a vision that is given to the people from God in the language of the Bible, right? And so the visual language of the Bible involves things like many waters. This is a passage, Hosea 6:6. No, is it Amos or Hosea? It's one of those two. Let justice roll down like mighty waters. So again, this is an image that is linked to justice rather than injustice. We get the loud thunder, which of course we associate with Mount Sinai. This one I am sure of. The sound that the people at the base of the mountain hear when Moses ascends to the peak of the mountain is a loud thunder. What else do we get? We get the sound of harpists, which is an interesting image. It's an interesting, combination with the thunder and with the waters, but this is a sound that we often hear in the Psalms. So once again, what we get here is, what seems to be a very profound danger. God's response to it is not to be terrified. God's response isn't even to be concerned in the way that we would think a king would be concerned, namely raising up an army, namely doing those things. But rather, this king already has an army marked out. This king already has an army in the field. And this king is behaving as if the celebration of victory has already started. I'll bring that last part up because in Revelation, sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Battle of Armageddon in Revelation. There's actually no battle. What happens is the armies line up at Har Megiddo, or the mountain of Megiddo, and then the next verse, victory is declared. So there's no actual battle fought. There's a reason for that, of course. Another one of Gilmore's rules for reading Revelation is think about it in terms of those first century persecuted believers. If their fate relies on their ability to gather up weapons, to train armies, to meet Rome on the field of battle, they have no hope. Their hope comes from the fact that it's not going to come down to a battle that they fight, but rather it's going to be a non-battle. It's going to look like a battle is coming, which it certainly does when you're under persecution. But then God's victory is going to come in such a sudden and striking way that it's going to be as if there was no battle. All right. So what else do I need to talk about here? Let's move on. Verses, how far shall I read? Let's go 6 to 13 here in Revelation 14. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth and sea and springs of water. Then another angel, a second, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Then another angel, a third, followed them, crying with a loud voice, those who worship the beast and its image and receive a mark on their foreheads or on their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured unmixed into the cup of his anger, and they will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. There is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of his name. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, Write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. Lots going on here, right? So first of all, as I said, we've got in the first part of chapter 14 an army lining up, these 144,000 ritually pure to participate in a battle. But then all of a sudden, in verse 8 that we just now read, the battle is proclaimed over. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Now, whenever you see Babylon in the book of Revelation, you need to understand something. This is a book based on a vision that is given to John, or Jonah, we talked about that name, in the late 1st century or the early 2nd century AD, okay? Now, I was curious about this, when I was in seminary about 20 years ago, so I undertook a few weeks of research on, why, they use Babylon here as their symbol. And really that's fairly straightforward. But the other question that I had was there still a city of Babylon? But because, of course, in the Old Testament, there very much is a city of Babylon. Daniel, faces his perils there. The people are dragged off there into exile. And here's the answer historically, and I'll try to make this digression worthwhile and also relatively short, and I'll probably hit 1 for 2 on it. The city of Babylon falls in, roughly speaking, 538 BC. It falls when the Emperor Cyrus of Persia has his engineers reroute the river that runs through the city so that people can march under the walls, basically, and their army can take the city without having to lay siege to the walls. All right. It becomes then a Babylonian city. It remains a Babylonian city for centuries. In the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great takes the city, and because of its great fame, he makes it the capital of his great land empire. But then here's what happens. Over the course of the next several generations, as Alexander's generals go to war among themselves for control of this grand empire, the city of Babylon itself, the physical city, the physical walls, the brick walls, become status symbols. People very literally carry off segments of the walls to make them part of their own capital city walls, to show them the great city of Babylon could not stand up to me. So here's the deal. By the late 3rd century BC, so much of the walls had been carried off that we actually have accounts of people trying to find the ruins of the old city of Babylon, and they can't find them anymore because the river doesn't go there anymore. The walls have been taken away. And so it's not until the 18th century AD, 2,000 years later, that people find the foundations of all the buildings that used to be the city of Babylon. Now, how does that all connect to Revelation? The answer is, when it uses Babylon here, it is talking about a city that, in very straightforward geographic terms, does not exist anymore. So it is using it as a symbol of the arrogant and the violent and the unjust imperial city. Okay, so here, fallen is Babylon the Great. You got to ask yourself, because the 1st century audience would have been asking themselves, what city is the arrogant, violent, unjust, invading city? And that's very clearly Rome. And so here, what we get is this vision that the forces of Rome are trying to put down those marked by the Lamb. And remember, the mark of the Lamb comes before the mark of the beast by several chapters. And what we get is a proclamation from heaven that the power of this new Babylon, which is to say Rome, is no more. It's fallen. Now, from what you can see in the world in the late 1st century, early 2nd century AD, Rome is very much still in power and still will be for generations. But spiritually, which is what Revelation is about, their power, their ability to exert force, to bend people to their will, to lay claim to an eternal power, God has just broken it by means of this revelation. And so, those who worship the beast, verse 9, and his image, and receive a mark on their foreheads and their hands, they will also drink the wine of God's wrath. Remember that tattoo imagery, is military imagery, right? So those who line up with the powerful, those who line up with the empire, those who line up with the violent, God's wrath is coming for them. And this is something, again, it's a vision given to the people in Bible language. Those who lined up with the Pharaoh, they drank God's wrath. Those who lined up with the Philistines drank God's wrath. Those who lined up with Assyria drank God's wrath. Those who lined up with Babylon, you get the picture, right? One of the things that the Bible insists on in Old Testament and New Testament is that those who line up on the side of the violent, of the oppressors, of those who would inflict injustice on the powerless, those are the people for whom God's wrath is reserved. Now, this is where another one of Gilmore's rules for reading comes in, because you got to think, who are these 1st century readers, these 1st century hearers who are getting this? They are not the people who are on the side of the powerful. They are, by definition, those people who are persecuted by the powerful. All right. And so, in their ears, this is a promise that what seems right now to be insurmountable, what seems right now to be unbeatable, has in fact already been beaten. It's not just that God will defeat them someday, but this vision has come and God has declared the defeat already of what seems to be the unbeatable power. All right. Let me see if there's anything else that I need to have a look at here. Verse 12, here's a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast, to the faith of Jesus. And verse 13, let's go ahead and talk about that too. Write this, blessed are the dead who from now on die in the Lord. So once again, it's an interesting take on time, because a lot of times I am tempted, I'll go ahead and speak for myself rather than anyone else. Good morning, Ron. I am tempted to think of, again, the timeline that the Bible presents as bad now, good later. Okay. What the resurrection of Christ on the first Easter indicates, and what books like Revelation indicate, is that it's a little bit more complex, so that we can truthfully say that God reigns in the present tense, even as we can also say, and we should also say, because it's what the Bible teaches us to say, that God's reign is not yet visible in the way that God's reign will be visible when it comes in its fullness. All right. This is, a pattern that, runs through the Gospels in the New Testament. It runs through Paul's letters. It runs through Revelation, of course. And it's a pattern that, biblical scholars call the already not yet character of God's reign. God already reigns in a spiritual sense, because the powers that would present themselves as invincible, God has already defeated them. God's reign is not yet, because we are still living in an age in which sickness and death and violence and injustice still can inflict suffering on us. All right. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled, I'll put it that way, dealing with, what we should do about that theologically. When we can all get together sometime, I'd be glad, to sit down and, talk about those things. And of course, right now, if you post a question on the board there, I'd be happy to talk about it. But what I want to emphasize right now before I move on to the next passage is that what we see here in Revelation, a declaration of God's victory and an acknowledgement that people are still suffering, this is not unique to Revelation. It's certainly not unique to the second half of Revelation. This is something that runs all the way through the New Testament, and that it inherits in a very real way from the Old Testament. Okay. So, starting in verse 14. Okay, and 15 is a short chapter, so I was worried there that I was going to run myself out of time, but it seems I'll be able to finish still, despite being windy this morning. All right, verse 14, Revelation 14. Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who had sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle to gather the clusters of the vine of this earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for a distance of about 200 miles. So, once again, the imagery here is from the prophet Isaiah. The idea that Israel in particular, and eventually, we get to talk about other nations as being God's vineyard. All right. And the vineyard is an image, if you read Isaiah, that, has to do with justice. Isaiah tells us fairly plainly that the grapes in that image are the grapes of justice. They are the fruit of justice. Of course, Jesus picks up this image in his own teaching in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It might be in John as well. I guess I am the vine, you are the branches kind of relates to that. But all the way through, there's this idea that the earth is God's garden. You should recognize that image from Genesis 2, Genesis 3, the idea that God expects for the garden to bear certain kinds of fruit. And almost always, there are exceptions, but almost always in the Bible, the fruit of that vine is going to be justice, right? So that's why when we actually put this wine in the press, what we get is not wine like we would expect, if we were to press grapes. And by the way, I mean, in the ancient world, they didn't have a separate term for wine and for grape juice. Basically, the unfermented grape juice that we recognize from our communion table for the ancient world would have just been wine that's not quite done yet. But back to what we're doing here. So here, when the wine is pressed, it comes out as blood, which is, of course, one of the plagues of Egypt. The Nile turns to blood, just as Pharaoh has shed the blood of the Hebrews and of the slaves. And here, the wine turns to blood because the Romans have shed the blood of the faithful in their persecution. Okay, so again, the promise here, once again, is that those who are persecuting right now, those who have the armies, those who have the power, those who have the weapons, those who have the ability to inflict suffering and to inflict violence on the faithful, God is not going to let that stand. So once again, this idea that I keep coming back to, because again, if we read it in that first century context, it's a very different book than if we read it outside of that first century context. For them, all of this violent imagery, which does disturb us in the 21st century, I'm not going to skirt around that, is a promise, but only because their own world is extraordinarily violent. They are living under constant threat of violence from the empire, violence from rivals like the Judean synagogue that would use the power of the empire against them. They are a people under threat, and so when God turns out to be a greater power than the current violent powers that they are living with, that is a word of comfort. It means that the violence that oppresses them does not get the last word. Okay? Now, it is 10:25. I need to cook here because you can't see it because they're over there. But off camera, Miriam and Mary are ready to load the Gilmore van and head over to Drive-In Church. So I need to wrap up here, and I will here in about 15 minutes. And that should give us enough time to talk about chapter 15. I'm going to read about 4 verses here. This is a short chapter, so this one shouldn't take us too long to talk about. I'll remind you again, if you want to write questions, write comments, you can feel free to over in the comment area. I'll also remind you if the YouTube feed, no, strike that. If the Facebook feed gets unreliable on you, there is a link over in the comments to a YouTube feed that I'm running at the same time right now. That's why Miriam's YouTube videos won't play right now, because I'm using up all the bandwidth. So you should see the face Miriam's making right now. It's great. But chapter 15, verse 1. Then I saw another portent in heaven, great and amazing, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, for with them the wrath of God is ended. And I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name standing beside the sea of glass, with harps of God in their hands, and they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Great and amazing are your deeds, Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Lord, who will not fear and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your judgments have been revealed. I love what's going on here because it makes reference to the Song of Moses and assumes that we know what it is. And we do know what it is. You can go read it if you want to. It is Exodus chapter 15. This is the song that Moses sings after the people have crossed the Red Sea and the armies of Pharaoh have been destroyed in the Red Sea. And it begins, something like Ashira Adonai Ki Ata. Ka'al, I think that's how it is. Anyway, it's been a few years. Point is that, it's a song of God's victory. So here in this moment, when the people have overcome when the people have endured the violence of Rome and seen God's triumph over that violence. And again, remember, this isn't happening in a place where the people who are hearing this the first time can see it, right? This is a spiritual reality that will come to its historical completeness later. Okay. Oh, now the cats are out here. Thanks, Miriam. But they sing that song of Moses because just as the people witnessed God overcome Egypt, now the people have witnessed God overcoming the new Babylon, which is Rome. Now, the other thing that is notable here is that, 7 angels with 7 plagues are going to represent the end of God's wrath, right? So just as the plagues end when Israel is liberated, freed from Egypt, so likewise, when this persecution ends, so God's wrath will end. This is not something that extends indefinitely, but it is God's response to the great injustice that is on earth in this moment. Now, does that mean for us, 2,000 years later, not quite 2,000, let's say 1,900 years later, 1,920, let's do that. Does that mean that, God has stopped doing things in the world? Not by any means, but the way that the Bible talks about God's great acts, mighty acts, as theologians sometimes call them, is that they are occasional. They happen now, and then in future generations, people tell stories about them. You can't show up at a given place expecting that the same kind of thing will happen. God is, among other things, radically free. God does what God does when God does it, and it falls to those who are present in those moments to bear witness to generations to come, because God is not under obligation to do the same. God, is obligated by God's nature, not necessarily by the impatience of mortals. Let's keep rolling here. Well, one other thing, you'll see that in verse 4 of this song, Lord, who will not fear and glorify your name, for you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your judgments have been revealed. This is once again speaking Bible to a people who are very familiar with the Bible. If you look in the prophet Isaiah, there are at least a couple visions of the nations coming to Zion to be taught the right way to live. This is the same kind of message, and as in Isaiah, when they are under threat from the Assyrian Empire, so likewise here, under threat from the Roman Empire, God presents this message to them that ultimately it is God and God's justice, not the violence and the injustice and the power of the empires of this world that are going to be triumphant. All right. Oh yeah, man, I'm gonna end early here, which never happens. Don't expect this in future weeks. All right. So verse 5, and it's really only because chapter 15 is so short. After that I looked, and the temple of the tent of witness in heaven was opened, and out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, robed in pure, bright linen, with golden sashes across their chests. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls, full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were ended. All right. So temple here is important because, of course, this vision is given to the people in the late 1st century, early 2nd century AD, when the Roman Empire has destroyed the temple that Herod the Great sponsored. So, I mean, we're not talking about a temple that you can plot on a map. We're not talking about a temple that anyone can visit here on earth. We were talking about this vision, Ezekiel 40 to 48, as I've told you before. That was the subject of my master's thesis 20 years ago when I was in seminary. But this is, a vision of a temple that is in heaven. This is the dwelling place of God, not the earthly temple, but the heavenly temple. God's wrath and God's justice come out of that temple. And what's important about that, the reason I'm dwelling on that is, first of all, because Revelation does. And the reason that Revelation does is because in the ancient world, and to some extent in the modern world, because, of course, part of the tactics of terrorism are sometimes to knock down very prominent public structures, as we've seen here in the United States. But, to destroy somebody's temple in the ancient world is a really, a double insult. On one level, it's an insult that says you don't have the military force to keep us from destroying the most important structure in your city. On another level, of course, it's an insult to your gods, saying your gods don't have the power to resist our armies as we come in and destroy this. We see this very explicitly in the middle chapters of Isaiah, also in 2 Kings, when these invading empires come in, and famously, and I'm trying to think which Assyrian it was. I'm going to say it was Sennacherib, but go check me in the middle of Isaiah. Comes in and says, don't think that your God is going to save you. The gods of every city that we have come to made that promise, and none of them has been able to keep the promise. Now, how that story comes out, I'll let you go to the middle chapters of Isaiah and find that out. I think it's chapters 36 to 39 if you want to go look at it. But here, out of this temple that is in heaven, so therefore it is beyond the reach of the empires of the earth, these angels are given 7 bowls full of the wrath of God. All right. Bowls, interestingly enough, are not military instruments. You sometimes see in medieval artwork, and sometimes even later Greek Empire and Roman Empire artwork, the idea of pouring flaming oil on people, a siege situation. That doesn't seem to be something that was on Israel's horizon here. What seems to be going on is these are religious instruments. These are instruments of religious ceremony. And so it is not God waging war against these empires, because that would indicate that God, thinks that God is in a war. Instead, God is simply asking for more worship, and the form that worship takes is going to destroy the spiritual powers that drive the military powers. All right. So, with all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and say that, we're coming up on the closing minutes here. So if you've got questions, comments, feel free to post them over on the Facebook area. But, I'm going to go to the 19th century in North America for a moment. This certainly wasn't the first place that this has happened, but it is the place that gives shape to the way that a lot of us imagine what's going on in the Bible, right? What happened there is preachers started to look at these visions in Revelation especially, but other parts of the New Testament as well. And because they are seeing cultural changes, and really bad cultural changes in their own moment, rampant alcoholism, godlessness, especially in the frontier territories, violence towards the weak, they start to, use these passages as threats against people in their own moment. Now, ultimately, I think that might not have been a bad thing. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if the culture had continued going in the direction it was going in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in America, it would have been a very different place than the place that we know. Not saying that federal prohibition was the answer, but I'm saying that it was answering a real question. All right. However, because of that tendency, when we 21st century people take a look at the Bible now, those habits tend to creep in. So what I'm trying to do in these lessons is to teach us a way to put some distance between us and those readings, not because ultimately we have to reject them, but because if we are aware of other options, it helps us to see things in those texts that we don't necessarily see if we're mainly reading them across the dusty road from the saloon. All right. Cast your imagination further back. Imagine hearing this in hiding as agents of the Roman Empire are going town to town and realizing that your life might end. What's going to make that significant? It's no less painful. It's no less violent. It's no less terrible. But what is going to make sense of it, what is going to make it bearable, is the fact that you are a chapter in a story that doesn't end with the power of Rome and doesn't end with the power of empire, but ends with the justice of God coming back to earth. And your role in that first century context, is to bear witness to that. So what I like to say is, the Bible can do both of those kinds of work. What I am concerned with is that, we don't cut off the promise part simply because we've gotten into the habit of hearing the menace part. All right. Well, at any rate, it looks like we're not going to have any more questions today. So I'm going to say a little prayer, and then I'm going to shut down my Sunday school rig out here on the front porch studio in Statham. And the Gilmores are going to get in the van and go to drive-in church. So pray with me, and then hopefully I'll see you in the parking lot. God, as we continue to read through Revelation, as we continue to try to see what those original readers and those original hearers saw and heard, I pray, God, that the richness of your scriptures might become a new gift to us if we came to think of these texts as, something we already know, that perhaps if we were afraid of them, if they were menacing to us, that we might receive them anew as a promise of your sovereignty and of the inability of the powers of this world to overcome your promises. And I pray, God, that as we gather in the parking lot and online and wherever else it is that we gather, that, God, your scriptures would continue to speak to us, that your table would continue to remember us, and that, God, your mission would continue to drive us to bear faithful witness, to love our neighbors, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And it's through Christ we pray these things. Amen. All right, friends, I'm loading up. I'll see you in the parking lot. Yeah, you might. I might have to haul the cushion in there. All right, end that stream.